All right, this is the introduction for Unit 2, which begins with Chapter 5, which is on the laws of motion. In order to get going in the laws of motion, we really need to understand forces. So 5.1 is about the concept of a force. In general, we think of a force as a push or a pull. Right, that's a very colloquial way to think of it. In particular, a force is an interaction between two objects. But I think it's fair to think of it as a push or a pull. All right, so there are different types of forces. There are 4 fundamental forces. There's gravity. There's the electromagnetic force. The weak force and the strong force. All right, these two work on a nuclear scale. So we're not going to really talk about them at all in this course. Gravity we'll talk about some, and the electromagnetic force would be covered in 202 in detail. What we do in this course is we focus on contact forces, which is a macroscopic approximation of electric force, right? If you imagine all the atoms in something and they're being pushed close to each other, all the electrons towards the outside of the atoms repel each other, and that's the actual force that you feel when you touch something, right? But we're just going to consider it as a contact force. So along with that, since we are going to talk about gravity, we know that gravity acts over a distance. Right? You don't have to touch something, right? You don't have to be in contact for gravity to act. And this type of force is called a field force. So we've got contact forces and field forces, but for this course, the only field force we're going to have will be gravity. All right, as the name implies for contact forces, that means touching, right? And let's think about that. There are a couple of ways to look at this. Am I getting ahead a little bit? I think it's okay to talk about it now. So when I look at a block sitting on the ground, well, we know that there's some gravity acting on this block, pulling it down, and it's also in contact with the ground. So there's a force that as it pushes into the ground, pushes back. So that force is called a normal force. So we have normal force, which is a contact force. And you have gravity, which is a field force. All right, so what other types of forces can we think about? There are several pictures in the book, you know, somebody pulling on a spring, and somebody kicking a football, that kind of stuff. All right, you got somebody kicking a football. This is a contact force, right? Their foot touches the football. And here they have a hand pulling on the spring. This is a contact force. But we're also going to talk about springs, in particular by themselves. So the interesting thing here is that the normal force I talked about up here, the contact force of hitting the football, those are compressive, right? Right, you're talking about the two things being forced together and pushing apart. The spring, we have, well, there's a compressive force here of the hand on the handle, right? But the spring itself is being pulled apart. And that resistance to be being pulled apart is called tension. So tension is something we'll talk about a lot too. Whenever we have a string or a spring, that's going to apply some tension force. So now if you imagine I have a bowling ball hanging from a rope, and we would talk about what forces are acting on the bowling ball. My rule of thumb for this approach is, what is it touching and is there gravity? Since we only have one field force we're dealing with, gravity, then you say, is there gravity? Well, this bowling ball has mass, and I haven't told you we're out in space or something, so I would assume that there's gravity, right? So we would have gravity. And then the only thing it's touching is the string. What's happening with the string? Well, the string is being pulled apart as the bowling ball's weight pulls it down. So it's a tension force. So the tension in the string. All right, I don't want to do too much in this video. I think we've got an idea. We talked about what the basic idea of a force is. It's pull, push or pull. Of fundamental forces, we're only dealing with gravity in detail. We'll approximate electromagnetic forces with contact forces. And gravity we're going to talk about as a field force. And then we talked a little bit about how we're going to approach problems and figure out what forces are acting on each object. So another important thing here is on or by or due to, right? We're only going to consider forces acting on an object. So as I've written here, only the forces acting on an object influence its motion. And we'll talk about that in more detail as we get into the laws of motion.